Hey, this is Luke Shermer of Launch Tomorrow, and I just want to share what I believe is the underlying cause of why delivery schedules get so inflated, particularly when you're developing a new product. There's an interaction between a number of areas, but before I go into detail, take a look at what's coming up. This is the kind of stuff that we do on webinars, and hope you join me on the next one. Well, in the context of new technology product where there's a lot of uncertainty, that's typically not how it works. So there's a wonderful book called Crossing the Chasm by a guy named Geoffrey Moore, who which came out a while ago, but essentially this is about the diffusion of innovations. It's kind of a common thing in certainly in a startup context, and basically it acknowledges that the way innovations move throughout a market tends to be in a, that there tends to be a number of smaller subsegments based on how willing people are to experiment with new things. And that actually, if you want to get a big chunk of the market, you've got to jump through a few hoops before you even get to that large chunk of the market. Uh, Otherwise, you get more or less what happened kind of in the whole dot bomb era, right? So Webvan's the best example where they raised $1 billion in funding, got the best team, built a system to distribute groceries based on things purchased online, and turned out at the time nobody was ready to really buy groceries online, right? So whereas nowadays it's completely normal. Um, so this is one piece of it, and the way this often plays out within a bigger company is that you want as much market share as possible. So in order to do that, you want to make the most attractive product possible. So, which means you add a little bit more scope. Oh, maybe that one extra feature or aspect or benefit that we can add to the product just to make sure that it's going to be more interesting. So to do that, you've got to push the release date back a bit. Okay, yeah, fine. But if you push the release date back a bit, that means that you the actual moment when you go to interact with your market is delayed also, right? So when that happens, that means that you're even less certain about anything particularly related in terms of market risk. Um, and in particular your revenue forecast. So it's all nice and dandy to have big forecasts, J curve up and to the right, in the billions after a few years. But if your level of certainty that that's going to happen is 10%, the you know the value of that financial model is actually quite low. So this goes back to this learning component that I was talking about earlier. That essentially, if you can increase your sense of confidence that these numbers are actually going to happen by validating on the market side, then you're more and more certain that these revenue forecasts will happen. So all that being said, the next concept I want to pull in here is this whole idea of 80/20, right? So the Pareto principle, and this plays out in lots of areas, but certainly in the software world, which is kind of where my background is. The the actual features which are used in pretty much any type of software application, there's only a handful that are used frequently. And in fact, to launch something, probably that's the main thing that you need. Everything else, yes, you can argue whether you should add it or not, but ultimately, if you can get that sliver of things which absolutely must be there for it to be relevant for a particular segment, then that's effectively all you need. Um, which I fully admit isn't always easy to do, but that doesn't change the fact that this is often the case with most new products. That if ultimately you want to be able to make at least one significant new claim with a new product that is going to differentiate it against other things which are available for that particular segment. And that 20% was typically going to be enough. So if you take the next step, ultimately what you really want is not the entire market, but you want early adopters, so going back to the Moore diagram, early adopters that are really keen on what it is that you're creating, so much so that they're willing to pay even though you only have that critical 20% of the scope done. So you want to be able to create a product that actually addresses that problem for them, which doesn't necessarily need to be all singing, all dancing. And I think the mistake a lot of people make is that they kind of separate out minimum viable product from how you define the market. And in fact, these things are really potentially tightly related. So depending on exactly how you slice your market, different features are going to be needed. And that minimum viable segment is typically going to be a group of people with similar or related needs. Ideally, it's relatively small, and also they'll be willing to refer each other. And the reason it's good that it's small is that it's very easy to dominate it, right? So if you pick off a small piece of the market, really get into that small group and really achieve significant market share there, it makes it very easy to move on from there. And by moving on, I mean moving on from these guys to these guys. And yes, there is a bit of a jump. They won't be exactly the same, but they will be referring each other. And again, you'll already now have something which is helping finance expansion into the next segment. And and yes, there is a concern that maybe it is too small. That particularly in a corporate context, right? You've got you're in billion-dollar markets now. You don't necessarily want to be playing around with things that are only going to be a couple million in size. Well, yes and no, right? So two things. So first of all, this this aspect of moving to adjacent markets is really important because first you get that foothold, but then you could move on to things which are next to it. So you expand out. So if you have 100% of a very small segment, that might only be 10% of a slightly bigger pie chart, right? So then you go on and you expand on the next one. That's one thing that's really important. The other is that there's market shifts. So market shifts, particularly in the context of growth. So in technology markets in particular, you, in a very short period of time, went from having MP3 players like this creative Movo thing to Apple coming up with its iPods, with its iPod approach, which essentially, from a technical standpoint, was an MP3 player just like the Movo, and lots of other offerings in the market. But one of the things that happened roughly around the time that Apple introduced the iPod and the iPod, ultimately the iPod Nano and all the other things, is that there was very, very robust growth, market growth for MP3 players. And that's a nuance that I think a lot of people miss with Apple's approach to marketing. When they do decide to create a category busting product, they generally go after categories that are already, or at least historically, that are already experiencing very high growth rates. That's when they go in and create something that's a much better user experience. They don't just wake up one day and say, we're going to make, I don't know, Apple toasters or something without knowing for sure that it's in a quickly growing market. Because what happens is you've got this kind of jump shift in especially in technology markets. Basically overnight, things can change. I mean, they did it again with phones, right? So almost within a very short period of time, the world went from BlackBerry to iPhone styling, and not just the iPhone itself, but then every other competitor was trying to knock off and do the same thing. So essentially, if you are releasing quickly, to loop back to the original point, and you've got these tight release times, you can actually respond to market shifts much faster. So there's a lot to being able to release frequently and often beyond just going faster.